So I'm here on 538.com and using their little college football playoff prediction tools. And we're going to try to figure out how the college football selection process is going to go. Now, I'm not necessarily I'll make predictions at the end, but my point here isn't to like predict what's going to happen, just what their process is going to look like and some of the possible outcomes. The first thing you need to know, I think, about the selection process is that one loss or better Power 5 champions basically never miss. They are in a tier of their own. It's like teams that do that, and then once you exhaust all of those teams, then it's everybody else 99% of the time. In fact, the only time that a one loss or better Power 5 champion has missed was in 2014 when the Big 12 didn't have a championship game and there were 6 of them. Outside of that, it doesn't happen. And that makes college football playoffs a little bit interesting right now because we have the potential of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. It's possible. And with Ohio State and Michigan, obviously, it could be either one. So when looking at that first group of teams, I think it is worth some discussion about what they would do in this scenario. I think it's incredibly unlikely. People always overestimate when looking into the future how likely it is that like the most likely things always happen. So like the odds of, TCU and, USC and Clemson all doing, it's not super likely, I don't think. But in a world where it does, I would say, honestly, their decision is going to be pretty easy. They're going to look at strength of schedule here. Obviously, Ohio State, obviously, Georgia, obviously, TCU are all undefeated. So it would come down to Clemson versus USC. I would say that USC has played a much tougher schedule, considering that they're also about to play Notre Dame, who's turned it around this season, and then they would go play Oregon, possibly. That would be a considerably tougher schedule than Clemson. Although they could, maybe if they beat UNC, there could be some style points that it comes down to. But as of right now, I would guess that they would put in USC. They also haven't put in the Pac-12 a ton. They've put Clemson in a ton of times. They'd like to get some other conferences in there as they could. So I would say that my ranking of this sort of like potential outcome would be Georgia, Ohio State, TCU, USC, and Clemson. Now, the one caveat to this is that you have the potential, if Georgia blows it to LSU, is that, okay, well, now you only have 4 Power 5 champions with that one loss or better record, but the team that would be out, the conference that would be out would be the SEC, and their strength of schedule would be so strong. So then the decision would become LSU or Clemson. And I think the people would want LSU. I think the committee would want to put in LSU. I think LSU would get in. But there is some world where maybe style points get Clemson in and LSU doesn't look that good, or maybe LSU blows it to Texas A&M. And a lot of that's true. Any of these teams could blow their game before the conference championship. So that's where the tough decision could come from. And we've never had that happen with the SEC as far as I can remember. I could be wrong, but I think ultimately they would lean towards LSU has played in a much tougher conference against much tougher teams. They would have then the best win of any team. Okay. That they would probably favor them over Clemson. And I think that would be the right thing to do. But it would be the first time they ever left out a Power 5 champion like that. So it would be unprecedented, but it would have to happen with pretty unprecedented things. And I think that's also a fairly unlikely scenario. But that's the boring stuff. That's talking about the tier 1 teams, which would be, and again, undefeated Georgia, undefeated Ohio State, undefeated TCU, Clemson if they went out, USC if they went out. And then LSU is kind of in a weird in between. They'd be 2 loss, but they'd be SEC. But let's say that you only have 3 of those tier 1 Power 5 champs, right? Then it starts to get interesting. Then you have to start talking about some like hypothetical teams. Where I think the confusion would come in is if you only have 3 one loss or better Power 5 champions, because then you start to go to that at-large group. And it's so hard to talk about who it could be with so many possibilities left. So I'm just kind of going to go team by team. Starting with Georgia, I think even if they lose to LSU and there's 4 one loss or better Power 5 champions, there's going to be people arguing they should be in there. Now, I do not think that they would get let in, probably, unless Clemson looks like really bad in the ACC championship game or something. Maybe they could jump them. But that would be against what the committee usually does. However, if there's only 3 of those tier 1 teams, Georgia would be the absolute first in if they lost to LSU. They play in the toughest conference. They have the toughest schedule. They're the best team. They should get in. So they would be like the absolute first team. And the scenarios where they lose and don't get in are like everything not going their way. Ohio State is interesting. If they lose to Michigan, it's a tough one because they don't get to play in a conference championship game at all. And for a while, I've been saying as an Ohio State fan that their schedule is not that good. And I just don't see how they should be allowed in, right? I think that, it's like Michigan is your playoff game. You have it at home. You win that game and you're in, But now you kind of look back and it's like, well, Penn State is a borderline top 10 team. Notre Dame's a borderline top 10 team. And one thing that could help them a lot, honestly, is like if Notre Dame were to win against USC, they could have 2 top 10 wins. And while, again, I don't think their schedule's been that tough, they're clearly one of the best 4 teams. And if they had 2 top 10 wins, they would be right there. I don't think they would get in over a hypothetical 1-loss Georgia, but they would definitely have a better shot than I thought they would. Now, where it kind of gets questionable is with Ohio State. Okay, would you let them in over an Oregon team that wins the Pac-12 or a Kansas State team that wins the Big 12? I do not know. I believe that 538 thinks that it's pretty close to a toss-up as far as their odds go. If you kind of click through and, well, it doesn't like that, but if you kind of click through and do that. But I wonder if the committee, who I think cares very much about putting in different conferences, would lean towards a 2-loss conference champion over Ohio State. My gut tells me that they would. And if that's the case, Ohio State's path to getting in the playoffs with a Michigan loss is very tough. But this is one of those times where it would come down to how pretty it looked. If they play, if they lose in double overtime to Michigan and Oregon squeaks by Oregon State, and then they barely beat USC, it's like, okay, they would think about it. But I would be very worried about it. It would be a serious decision, right? Sometimes a committee is in positions where it's like, obviously, this is what you're going to do. Sometimes they have to make serious decisions. That would be a serious decision. So Ohio State is pretty questionable if they're not, that Power 5 champion. Then you get to TCU. They have some interesting scenarios. Let's say they lose to Iowa State and win the Big 12 championship. That probably doesn't affect them a ton, to be completely honest with you. I think that we were talking earlier about where do you rank those 1-loss Power 5 champions if everybody wins out. That would move them down to the bottom, right? They don't really like TCU that much. They have not played that tough of a schedule. They've barely won some games where they really should be taking control. So they'd be below even Clemson. But again, if it came down to they were one of the only 4 teams with a Power 5, champion, which I think is pretty likely that it's not going to turn out with all 5, they would get in. What's maybe the other thing is that what if they beat Iowa State and then lose in the Big 12 championship game? So let's say it's Kansas State, but they beat Iowa State. I think their odds are also still pretty bad. Their resume would just not have a lot of meat on the bone. I wouldn't put them in over a Georgia who didn't win it. I wouldn't put them in over an Ohio State that didn't win it. I wouldn't put them in over a Kansas State who beat them, honestly. Probably wouldn't put them in over an Oregon who won. So they would need a lot to break their way. I can't even trying to imagine the scenario. Maybe they need Clemson to lose and then Michigan to lose the Big Ten championship game. And I guess that's another thing we haven't really talked about is if Michigan or Ohio State loses the Big Ten championship game, but it's going to be a very easy matchup. And I think it's very unlikely considering that they're going to probably be playing Iowa. Looks like they're going to do it. And Iowa is just not super serious on offense. Clemson, their win the ACC scenarios or their lose to South Carolina, win the ACC scenarios are bleak. I would not put a Clemson in over an Oregon or a Kansas State that won the Pac-12 or Big 12 respectively. I would even wonder if I would think about Alabama or Tennessee before them, or a Washington that won the Pac-12. Or if they don't win the ACC, then it's UNC, and UNC would be the team that you would be really looking at. So they absolutely must win out. They're already ranked very low for a team that's 10-1. Then you've got Michigan. There's also been some talk since them and Ohio State are kind of considered very, very close that, well, what if they lose the Ohio State game? But I think their odds become very bad. I don't have it in front of me. Do they have one ranked win? And it's just against Penn State? I just don't think that's enough if you don't win your conference. And I know it's tough because they'd be 11-1. And I kind of do believe they're a top 4 team. But at some point, you have to have the resume, and I don't know if they do. I think they would be slotted behind a lot of two-loss, Power 5 champions, honestly. And there's certainly a world where it happens. Again, if the game is close or if they get blown out, these affect it greatly. But even in a close loss, I kind of think it would be bogus if Michigan got in with the teams that they've played. And they just barely survived against Illinois. So it's not like they've just blown absolutely everybody out and then they get to Ohio State and they play a really tough game against a really good team and happen to lose. The other thing about Michigan is that, and I know I'm a little biased against them, so take that for what you will. But let's say if Michigan does get in, the most likely scenario is that they'd be playing Georgia round 1. And I really don't want to see that rematch. Those are two big, tough physical teams. Well, Georgia is the bigger and more physical team. I would probably end up with Georgia blowing them out again, right? So it's a matchup I'm not interested to see. The resume's not that good. I don't think that any of these teams would match up well against Georgia, to be fair. I don't think a two-loss Oregon would fare any better. We've already seen that one too, so I guess that's not the best point in the world, but you get what I'm saying. And then after that, I think the idea of any of these teams not winning their conference and getting in, you start to get to like pretty unlikely scenarios where there's a world where USC loses to Notre Dame and then plays in the Pac-12 championship and wins. And then they get in because like Clemson blows a game and TCU blows a game and Georgia blows a game. But like we're starting to talk like really unrealistic scenarios. I could try to go through every possible thing that could happen, but I just can't. But I think these are probably Michigan, TCU, Ohio State, Georgia, probably the only teams where you're like, you can lose from here on out and still find a way in. I guess USC is in that category if we're going to consider like a two-loss Oregon, a two-loss Kansas State, or a two-loss Washington in it as well. But that starts to get where you'd need like only one or two Power 5 champions with one loss or better. So I guess that's how I'm looking at it. I know I've been a little bit all over the place this video, but the general thesis is how many one-loss Power 5 champions are there? They're all going to get in. Then it's everybody else at large and who are the top at-large teams. So that's the way I tried to talk about it. If you want to know my predictions, if I had to guess, I do think Georgia beats LSU, but I think LSU has a puncher's chance at that. I feel uneasy as an Ohio State fan predicting that they will beat Michigan. That's going to be a tough game. Ohio State's defense is a lot better than it was last year, but that's going to be a tough game. I think that if this was at Michigan, I think that I would pick Michigan. I think it's at home for Ohio State. That matters a ton in college football. I will pick Ohio State to win it. And then it gets really tough. Do I think TCU is going to win out? I kind of don't. I kind of think that there's a really good chance that TCU blows the Big 12 championship game. There's a really good chance that Clemson blows it to UNC or possibly the Gamecocks, although I don't want to get too high on them over that Tennessee win. But if Rattler plays like he did against Tennessee, yeah, South Carolina could win that game. And I don't love USC's chances. I do think they're the best Pac-12 team. But Notre Dame is very legit right now, and then you have to go play another very legit game. It's tough to beat. It's tough to win that many in a row. But then if I'm predicting TCU not to win, Clemson not to win, USC not to win, then it's like, yeah, you're getting into those super unlikely scenarios. I don't really feel super strongly about any of them. And they're all really tough. I like, of those three teams I just listed, TCU, Clemson, USC, I like USC the best. They have the toughest path. But you see how this is the college. It's like I understand what they're looking for when it comes to the College Football Playoff Selection Committee, but there's just so many possibilities left. I thought this video would be way easier. It's not. I'm going to say that USC pulls it off. Why not? And honestly, I think Clemson pulls it off maybe, and then TCU. I guess. Well, that'll be my predictions. I think it'll be Georgia, Ohio State, USC, and Clemson. I'm not super confident about Clemson, but they're also not necessarily going to play UNC because UNC still has a very tough game against NC State left. And I don't think South Carolina is going to put up a good fight against Clemson, so they kind of just need to win the ACC championship game. I think their defense is very, very good, but that's far from a guarantee. I think TCU is kind of due a little bit. They've had a really nice run, but can they get through one more? But you're seeing how many possible scenarios there are. I think Oregon and Kansas State are very much still in the fight, but they need some help. So that'll be my prediction. I'm not telling you this is the way it's going to be for sure, but I'll go Georgia, Ohio State, USC, Clemson. I think that'd be a pretty decent playoff. But thank you guys for watching so much. If there's any scenario that I left out that I didn't talk about that you want to talk about in the comments, I'll definitely be there. Maybe the rankings will come out here soon and shed some light on this. Again, I'm recording before that happened. But do all the other stuff you're supposed to do on YouTube videos, like, comment, subscribe, go watch the podcast, all 170 episodes in order, and I'll catch y'all next time.